A few months after the event, my sculpture artwork was removed from the National Art Exhibition. China changed as the extreme communist regime was toppled and the new leadership stopped practicing the so-called class struggle theory. In the meantime, the high education once again became accessible for people who could pass entrance examinations. Until then, for about a decade long, all the Chinese universities and college campuses were only open to those with the special credential of the time, which basically boiled down to one, your family background were from those supposedly had absolutely nothing in the times before the regime. And number two, you have had the re-education in either the countryside or in the factories, and there was no entrance examination necessary. Basically, you earn your credential by going to countryside or factory to do your hard work, and of course given that your family background, your father, your grandfather, supposedly they were all very, very poor, so that you can hold your head really high and be proud. Well, that became a history, and starting from 1977, the new policy came to light. So if we could pass the examination, we could enjoy high education. So I had this conversation with my father, what would be the major that I should go into? Obviously, my almost exclusive interest back then was in art. And my father told me, no, with our kind of family background, you do not want to be majored in arts or literature or anything that could really get yourself in trouble. I don't blame him. I mean, given his own history, he came to realize that it really dearly cost not only just to him, but to me and to my sister. Back in 1957, the great leader himself had a great idea to set up a big trap for the people who did not like communism and get them to talk. And so my father was invited to a conference where the government officers invited everybody to offer their comments to improve the great communist leadership and their specific policy and administration and management. So my father offered his own opinion, and he's the kind of guy always speak up his mind, and so he did. When he came back, he became classified as a rightist. You have people on the right, people on the left, and he was officially classified by the government as a rightist. It was basically about the same time when McCarthy in the United States pretty much trying to find out who was the communist in the artist and intellectual circle. So you see the two countries, they were just doing the same thing, only in the opposite direction. Anyway, back to the point, it would have seemed that my father learned his political lesson, and it was his strong idea that I should not go into anything remotely related to art or literature as a major. And of course, in the economy of planning by government, basically whatever major you choose, that becomes your profession all your life until your death. So I was not encouraged, in fact, not allowed by my father to go into the profession. I had a friend who was doing sculpture with me together all the time until then, and she went into the #1 art education institution, the Central Fine Art Academy of China. So what did I do? My father was a trained engineer, and he wanted me to be another engineer in the family, and frankly, I wasn't interested. As a compromise, or at least I thought it was a compromise, I went into a maritime academy in Shanghai. It may sounded like a joke, at least to my daughter today, that my motive of going into maritime academy was to sail around the world and eventually, come back as a good poet or a novel writer. Because back then, the only way for a citizen of the People's of Republic of China could go around the world was to be a seaman, and that was my plan. So I went into a maritime academy only to find out that because I was wearing glasses, and that disqualified me for being a seaman. So I was transferred to shore management major. And before I left Beijing, my father told me specifically not to bring anything that was for art practice. He wanted me to concentrate on the work that basically whatever the curriculum required, even though for the fact that I did not go into engineering school, and for that he did not talk to me for 3 months like we were strangers. Anyway, so I went to Shanghai and I went into the Maritime Academy, and I did not have my art supplies with me. So what I did, I decided, you know what, I'm gonna go into literature. So I had my master's that I set up myself, of course, encouraged by them, in apprentices. One of them was a very famous movie director, and the other was the most famous literature critic of the time. And I practiced my writing in the 4 years of school life in the Maritime Academy. I wrote about several million Chinese characters of word counts in short stories. And of course, every time at the end of the process, I would present to my masters. And the advice I got from them, which really made sense even today, was on the premise that my language, the literature language, they thought was very good, and they could tell that actually benefited from or draw from my good foundation in the classic Chinese literature, poetry. What they pointed out was I was at my early 20s and I was writing stories about people in their 50s and 60s and lived through the kind of political life my father and his peers did. And what they told me, which I still remember and try to stay conscious of that, was if you try to touch other people's heart, you need to have that deep experience coming from your own heart. You don't try to fool other people, because you have to have this coming directly from yourself and to have a real feeling about it before you go about to write it. Well, after 30 years in the United States, my Chinese became a little rusty, but the rule still apply. So instead of continue in the visual art practice, I did a lot in my 4 years college. I did a lot in creative writing. But that was not to say that I did not do any visual art practice, because after all, I became a person in charge of arts and entertainment in student union. But nevertheless, the literature part prepared me extensively and intensively for my later visual art practice.